It's wonderful to hear such an eloquent introduction. I don't recognize myself. Can you hear me in the back? Is the mic picking? I have to tell you that what I'm reminded of when there's such a generous introduction, I'm reminded of my friend Alexander Cruz's story about his student he teaches in the Philippines, a well-known man. He told me this in passing, so I never could ask him exactly why this happened, but he told me that one of his male undergraduate students had said, striking his thigh, "I hate Spivak." You digest that one, huh? So, I also thank Elder Larry Grant for his very moving welcome. I speak in the name of Helen Osborne and Felicia Solomon. I have been looking at the text, what their stories tell us, and I myself feel very much that these women are not numbers. The idea of, although I'm appalled by the numbers obviously, the idea that we have to learn to imagine these people as individuals, I think that's the task. I call it, in a kind of mouth-filling phrase, epistemological performance, but that's what I mean. How do we construct people as objects of our knowledge? Knowledge is not just the will to power through knowledge. It is, in fact, also raga, in fact, means intended affect. It's a Sanskrit word, and I know these days we look for names so that we can have these appropriate acronyms. I think that's fine. And but that's what it is, eh? That's what raga is. So I'm also very moved to be in the First Nation House of Learning. I think, and I urge people to think of India as an old settler colony. Of course, historically, it's my friend Ramila Thapar tells me, she's a very good friend of mine, she tells me that the historical lines of that description are not clear, but I don't need historical lines. I'm not a historian, I'm a literary person. So when the Indo-European speakers came, many thousands of years ago, we seem to occupy ourselves by proving our so-called post-coloniality by looking at European colonialism just day before yesterday. But it is what we really have to take into account, and it's not really sort of great, wonderful activism, but nonetheless, the work of teaching at two ends of the spectrum, Columbia University, and very sort of high up, PhD, not South Asia, but their dominant languages, and so on. And at the other end, these two districts in West Bengal, in my mother tongue, rural children, and in both places people need help, you know what I mean? These global classrooms where my students are completely ready, quote, to help, unquote, which is a very scary thing. On the other side, people who take their wretchedness as normality. So this is also a deeply scary thing. And what we we're looking at there is the fact that people of my sort, to an extent, and history is larger than personal goodwill. I had parents who were plain living, high-thinking, ecumenical, anti-casteist, good people, but that's just two generations. But they bred up these people who are my students and parents of my students now, cognitively damaged, because for thousands of years, bred up for manual labor, punished for intellectual labor, because they were obliged to obey. One sees this kind of cognitive damage, and one tries to devise ways of teaching which would not resemble our kind of very benevolent middle class, have you hugged your kid today type teaching, where you can assume that there are books in the background. It's a very different, it's a profound cultural difference, and in fact I will agree with you. I'm not in favor of illiteracy. And enforced illiteracy is not orality. But nonetheless, I will say that bad education so destroys the mind, that, and even such cognitively damaged mind, that in one of the districts, Nimai Lohar, who's completely illiterate, is the smartest man because education has not ruined him. And how is it that I, who entered kindergarten in 1946 and never left school, that I should utter this sentence? I'm for education. And in the other area, Tulu Shabor, who was also an illiterate, he was the one who understood in detail what, in fact, the imagination was there standing guard, although because bad education was not able to ruin their thinking. So one has to think about these details when one considers the idea of being post-colonial. These settler colonial outlines are very different from the kind of study that has been offered as post-colonial studies. I didn't quite know that I was doing stuff like that when I began, and the moment I realized that I became its critic. But the label stuck, and so I'm thought of as Poco, whatever happens. But I would like to say that wonderful, wonderful title, Post-Colonialism and Critical Pedagogy, that's your title, right? I thought that my title was The Only Activism I Know, and so to an extent the difference between these two titles is where I'm hanging out. One of the things, if there's anything that's at all interesting about me, it is that I move around a great deal. I'm a convention junkie. I do not believe fundraising is activism, but it is true that because I'll read a little, something about it as I go on, but because there are reasons why I do not accept corporate funding, I need money all the time, isn't it? Therefore, I go around, I give lectures. And so I have to know how, this is my field work, as it were, cultural politics, how different groups perceive things that we give one kind of meaning to. For example, you cannot speak of Marxism in the same way. Today, in fact, you cannot speak of Marxism, and not really the word is communism in West Bengal, but you cannot speak in my neck of the woods in West Bengal about communism quite in the same way that you could, let's say, 15 years ago, and you certainly cannot speak about it in that way. I'm going to go to the Balkans in May, and I will have to think about how to talk about it, because, you don't, in Croatia, they're beginning to engage for socialism and so on. I was told in India at a certain point, and when I was a member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, I was talking about South Africa in some way, and I was told by in fact, a female member of the collective, Gayatri, we are having enough difficulty looking after things in India, and you don't bring South Africa in. I resigned quietly. They refused to accept my resignation, so I remained hanging suspended until the group itself kind of died. But nonetheless, if there's anything in me at all, it is this thing of going all over the place. Every place thinks of itself as the center of the universe, and someone, which is fine, which is good, it's kind of a polycentric business, but as one moves through and one wants to know what one could say, one learns a lot of things. So I begin with something that I said in Japan, about which now we have to think very gravely. There are no jokes there, but I did say this to the 20th anniversary of the Japan Society for International Development, and Japan knows a thing or two about international development. I was asked to do a keynote, and what do I know about alternative development? But I did say that the specifically post-colonial point of view, and I believe that's what you were saying, and both of you were in fact saying this, I agree with you, the specifically post-colonial point of view is perhaps not altogether suited to the situation of development today. Varieties of post-colonialism are necessarily tied to varieties of national liberation, and subsequently to waves of migration from the formerly colonized countries, basically to the former colonizer. This is a traffic between nation-states, and in the current context, the nation-state is not the most important theatre. Development must be thought of in terms of globalization, although it is still measured by the nation-state. Hence, the somewhat misleading invocation of post-coloniality as such. If, on the other hand, we transfer, and this is what you're doing, a more generalized post-colonial approach to the global context, we can see a particular variety of new imperialism development. And I was talking about this yesterday, sort of anti-imperialism. Raymond Williams's Bloomsbury faction, my friend Joseph Stiglitz, and very slightly now, I don't want to rock the balance of voting here, but somewhat also Michael Ignatieff. This whole, I mean, I knew him as an intellectual, not really as someone who has entered into politics, but this kind of thing is something that we have to think about in terms of post-coloniality rather than, as you say, identity politics. This thing, the dominant global denomination, the story is that the rich nations collectively hear the call of the ethical and collect to help the poor nations by giving skill and money. There are therefore elaborate and visible structures of public consultation in place. The ways in which these structures are manipulated, well-publicized occasions of exchange which are minimally disseminated or not disseminated at all, promises that are made without intention of performance, quote, pure performatives, and in-house decisions, not to honor the results of consultation, being only a few, can be documented. As I said last night, in the 40s of the last century, when the United Nations was being put together, W.B. Du Bois dared to say to Eleanor Roosevelt that the organization was repeating the old colonial structures, and he was obliged to leave his relatively minor post on the planning committee. What Du Bois had understood was that the establishment of these bodies of future world governance was, in intention at least, the most benevolent age of global imperialism, as territorial colonialisms were being dismantled and the world was getting ready for a possibility of post-coloniality that had to be managed. The Brazilian thinker Mariana Chauí has described this intention as what amounts to a distortion of the ethical task, internalized through a robust teaching of the humanities, a practice not encouraged in our time, and I quote her. In order for non-sufferers, says she, to be conceived as ethical, two forms of violence are necessary. The first is the existence of victims, the second is the treatment of another as a passive and inert victim, no more than needy bodies. And people always ask me, because they can't figure out why it is that 4 of my schools, 20 years' work, were closed by the local landowner. It was because the one boy, the girls were completely robotized still. He was able to distinguish between good education and bad education. If you look at even the Human Development Index, you will see that the entire education thing is statisticalized. How many years of education? And yet when it is our children, we go around all over the place spending lots of money to see where we would get the best education possible. So this idea that literacy, numeracy by itself, as I said right at the beginning, they are not unquestioned goods unless they are taught instrumentally in order for something to be built on them. So this idea that the boy had, he spoke to me, he said, Auntie, what's happening, Mashi? What's happening is that they are, because of course our schools were just elementary, right, from infancy to class 4, and he was now in a high school, and he said to me, you is very, very smart, very smart. What they're doing is stuffing me with knowledge, exactly what Freire had spoken about, he came to, because they want a tribal boy, Mashi, to come first for the first time. It will be a record in a school with Hindus and Muslims. I don't want this, said he. He said, I want to be in a school where everybody is tribal, so that there is no special, nothing special is done for me. Now the landowner was afraid of me, especially since I was giving money, not much, but nonetheless it was my money that the schools were, I was running them. And so he waited until I left, and then he evicted the boy, and he closed the school, and the parents of these boys were very scared because they had gotten something like a spirit, which of course did not last because the schools were closed. They hadn't yet caught on to anything. So it wasn't that they were ready to be cannon fodder. That's fine. But democratic judgment, not self-interest, that's a very scary thing to see in the so-called subaltern, right? So the other boy said, the first boy is evicted, we are going to. So in the night, they all left, and their parents were incredibly scared that these children had dared to question the leader. So to an extent, that idea of quality is where for me everything rests. Now I had many other things that I felt I could talk about, but then I remembered that I had a thing that I had written called The Engaged Feminist Intellectual, because Frigga Haug, whose name some of you in the audience will know, my generation of feminists, German feminists, she asked me to write something on the subject of the engaged feminist intellectual, this was her judgment, like your generosity friends are generous. But this has been published for the 50th anniversary of Dr. Mate. This has been published in German, but not in English, and I thought it would be a better thing to read to you than just kind of keep on talking about various things as they come in my mind in response to your in response to the difference between post-colonialism and critical pedagogy. I don't, in fact, use the word pedagogy; it's too heavy. I say teaching, and I'm not bad with hard language, you know. I mean, people are on record, published criticisms of Spivak as obscure, so don't. I'm not saying you should use simple language. Come on. You're super educated people at universities. Let it go a little. Pedagogy, I somehow always say teaching. And for me, of course, critical, since last night again I was saying that there's bad faith in just knocking out good European brothers. My sense of critique comes from Kant, and that, of course, is to an extent looking at the subjective structures of production. And so when that happens, then I don't think I stand here giving you a lecture. So let's go to that thing I wrote for my friend Frigga. Only 15 minutes have passed so far. The Engaged Feminist Intellectual. How feminist am I in my salaried work? How engaged? How intellectual? It seems to me that our first instance of engagement is in how we have chosen to support ourselves, even if unwillingly, because with that support we think we can be engaged feminist intellectuals outside. I often think that feminism is in my bones, but what feminism is it that is in my bones? I often think that if I ponder about it, I will not be speaking about social engagement as a feminist. When it comes to social engagement, I repeat, you must think of how you have chosen to support yourself, because in spite of yourself, that is how you have, depending on what you have chosen, inserted yourself in the abstract circuit of capital, and the repercussions of your action determine your engaged work. When I think of the feminism in my bones, my mother comes first to mind, and behind her my construction of my foremothers, a quote memory constructed out of stories told in the family. And many of you know, in terms of Can the Subaltern Speak, that my lesson in the relationship between ethics and politics, and the fact that particularly violent conjunctures like Palestine do not allow those who are pacifists to be ethical, this lesson comes to me from a family scandal, my 17-year-old great-aunt Mawani, who hanged herself. My foremothers. If capital is the strongest agency of validation into modernity, and has been since the 17th century, when previous imperial formations and mercantile formations change into the capitalist mode of production, in this place I am held by a much older agency of validation, reproductive heteronormativity, RHN. It holds us, as I've said many times, in a double bind. If you love your mother, you are in RHN. If you hate your mother, you are in RHN. If, as a gay person, you make a structure which looks somewhat like a family with children and so on, what you're doing is, in the Nietzschean sense, using RHN in an extra-moral sense, and so on. It's a very complicated thing. It's not something you can just blow away. And that's what I'm held by. Let us say, with these foremothers, let us say that it is between these two, capitalism as modernity and reproductive heteronormativity as the chief recoding instrument of capital, thoroughly internalized, that the engagement of the feminist shuttles. The job is everybody's choice of a mode of living. Like many, quote, engaged persons, I also have another job which is outside of this choice. This is my engagement with maximal teacher training that I was speaking about for 25 years. Now, the foundation actually, you'll see, is not related to this. It was my friend Laura Metzger, who didn't have a great deal of money, ran away. She was older than I, ran away from Nazi Germany when she was 13. When she died, she left me $10,000 in 1997. What was I going to do with it? So I established $10,000 for a foundation that it's not going to feed the hungry for too long. But so I established the foundation. But that's not what it is really. We don't touch it. Our overhead is zero. The job, okay, so now for 25 years. In the opening I said that the instrumentalization of the salaried job for the propagation of the, quote, real job is not perhaps very intelligent, and we are speaking of the feminist intellectual. We must think through engagement in terms of the relationship or non-relationship between the two jobs, which is why, although fundraising is a good thing, there is so much confusion in thinking, and children are taught this, that fundraising is activism, that we must stop before we actually go forth with this. And you know, again I say to Larry that the idea of somehow earning the right to be counted, you know, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Calcuttan, I'm a New Yorker, I love New York. And I was undone on the day of 9/11. I was in Philadelphia, and I actually hitchhiked my way when everything was closed into that dark and wet, smelling of charred flesh, that kind of suffering city. But at the same time, the way in which it is sentimentalized and made into a commodity and made a right reason for all kinds of violence, we forget the state legitimation of Hiroshima. We forget the incredible numbers destroyed by the waves of named and unnamed colonialism. So I agree with you. And you can't say this. If you say this, then you're not being a solid, sympathetic person as a New Yorker. So this is something that one has to remember. But anyway, if the relationship is to instrumentalize, then I think there is a reaction formation which wants to deny the often larger social role of the one unwillingly chosen. This applies to a salaried job as much as it does to a feudal job, such as marriage. Let us carefully... You know, we've written a book on this, so I'm just not just using that adjective unwisely. My parents had a fantastic marriage, but like I say, history is larger than and so on. Let us carefully think through the meaning of freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is something that is denied to race, class, gender, compromised people. Therefore, in our activism, we cannot ignore freedom of choice as a desirable opportunity for which we must strive to build the best possible social and political infrastructures. But the freedom from oppression that spells out freedom of choice cannot be an end in itself. We must keep in mind that the end is the freedom to be able to understand that an achieved juridical, legal, socio-political freedom of choice should allow the individual to realize that this concept metaphor has been, in the narrative of modernity, deeply imbricated with capitalism as a pursuit of happiness. So, in fact, I got an email from someone in the Green movement in Iran this morning. I'm rather involved with that. And she had as a title, Cultural Emancipation Precedes Political Liberation. No, none of these things precede and none of these things postcede. They are, in fact, it's very difficult to teach the practice of freedom while looking for liberation. But believe me, it's something that needs to be done. And right now, I don't want to give you detailed examples, but I could give you many examples of this. And you don't become popular when you do this. We must keep this in mind. Alas, it is in the area of the unwillingly chosen and kept job that we, in fact, in our lives, act out the limits of freedom of choice. And this is where the truth of our engagements lies. This irreducible compromise should tell us more about our engagement than the sustainable activism. What does sustainable mean? The maximum of compromise in order to achieve the minimum of activism. That's what sustainable is. It's a palliation of double bind, which is what, like you're bound both ways, contradictory instructions come at the same time. But you then change that metaphor into this maximum of something in order to do the minimum of something else and call it sustainability. I think that the initial non-relationship between Colombia and the village work, which of course meant an economic instrumentalization of Colombia, has been now transformed to the extent, and that's where I began, that the latter feeds the former intellectually now. My only evidence comes from the fact that, although I am within limits, personally within my salaried work, and abundantly honored but not particularly welcomed, I mean, for these power thingies, fundraising thingies. You know, it's very good to be kicked upstairs as the only female of color to be a university professor in Colombia's entire history, and not another one is coming. But having done this, wait before you applaud. Having done this, they don't have to do anything else. You know, not a word of any kind of engagement is listened to. The kind of corporatization of the university can proceed, just as, you know, when Garen Heilbrand resigned, everybody suggested, we hired Gayatri Spivak, we are feminists. It was incredible. That was the silencing of Garen Heilbrand. In the same way, you give this kind of a big token honor to one person or whatever, and then you decide. And remember, in terms of the Indian situation, I'm one of the colonizers. So, in fact, I'm part of an 86% or more, often violent majority in the world's so-called largest democracy. And it's useless to treat me as a token minority and give me that kind of honor and then silence me. So to an extent, I am abundantly honored. This isn't the rest of the sentence, I should say. I need to have said all this. Institutionally, my projects are not noticeably supported. This must say that my engagement with my salaried work, now determined by the other kind of work, is out of joint with the institution. I cannot go any further than this in establishing its validity, and it's very true. You know, my very dear student Vishupal Limbu yesterday won the prize for the best dissertation. I used to say to Marshita Devi, Purashkar na Tirashkar, I'm not going to explain that one. But poor Bishu, you know, he's a younger lad. I reprimanded him all evening. I said, Bishu, you know, you're being tokenized, man. Look at what you're a small-sized gay guy, you know, and you've written every chapter, you're telling me, you know, post-colonial, transnational, you've got everything in there. You've been tokenized, never accept another prize, you know. and pack so that I can catch the train to my village work. What comes to me very strongly is that in many ways, in order for what we recognize as feminism to operate as an engagement, we must presume socialist norms. Today, I mean, however much we speak in terms of identity, and we should. Nonetheless, we must presume them, which are written within capitalism, because it means turning the use of capital from capitalist to socialist uses. Where there is no agency of turning, and the development of capitalism not noticeable except inchoately by the remotely victimized, the task has been picked up today by the international civil society, which I have described as, quote, self-selected moral entrepreneurs on many occasions. These people are confident that gender redress can be computed in terms of making the phenomena of gendering accessible by general terms provided by world governance. And that style documents, every unit fought over in PrepCom meetings, everything most simply understood as in a PowerPoint presentation, as in knowledge management plans, decisions made by logic rather than subject engagement. I have here, I think I'll take too much time here, so I won't go there, but I have here a thing that I said in Delhi in February about the kind of mistake people make in organizing protest in these kinds of subaltern areas. Good-hearted NGOs go in organizing protests against dowry, child marriage, etc., not realizing anything about the cognitive damage because they don't stay long enough. So, but this I won't read. Anyways, a certain kind of anti-capitalism, not invariably present in this sector, which is often dependent upon, and happily so, upon corporate funding, substitutes for a proactive socialism here. The slow and deep language learning that must accompany accessing cultural infrastructures, so real long-term change might be envisaged, is largely absent. The distinction between problem solving and the uncoercive rearrangement of desires, between Doctors Without Borders and primary healthcare, let us say, is often ignored here. This kind of feminist engagement is not noticeably intellectual. If the intellectual is a person who analyzes the existing situation before choosing the most convenient instrument for solving a problem that has been constructed as a case by looking at the grid established by people in a completely different level of capitalist society. A word about deep language learning. It is to learn a language unconditionally, not for an immediate purpose, so that one accesses what the anthropologist Alton Becker has called the lingual memory. It is when one can navigate among articulations in that language that are not substantively learned and can code switch within the language more and more. And this code switching today is really the description of upward class consciousness. It was never only economic, because I mean, you've seen very, very rich people wearing the trench coats with them inclining, which you can't see. So class consciousness is not really conspicuous consumption, etc. But this code switching has now become, and I could give many examples. And you know, this language learning, it's not confined to academics. In the first state where I used to go, the tribals, the aboriginals, whose language had really been stolen from them, they in fact were constantly trying to teach me what they thought was their language, which was really a kind of old Goria Prakrit Bengali Creole. But nonetheless, their sense that I should be taught both the languages is the kind of thing that I am talking about, because of course they were obliged to speak my language well enough. So this is to be distinguished from access to a substantively constructed cultural memory, which I have elsewhere called a privatization of history as evidence. When Marx describes revolutionary practice in the 18 Brumaire of Rue Bonaparte as learning a foreign language so well that when producing in it, the person forgets the language rooted in him or her, I believe the description is taken from this kind of language learning. It's not a permanent forgetfulness. It is, once again, code switching for the purposes of usefulness. As in the welcome, you know, it is appropriate that I do not understand unless I take the trouble, because I know what is being said. I'm being welcomed as bloodkin, although I'm not, and I'm being welcomed according to ancient ritual that RAGA already fills the room. But there are places, you know, when, for example, in the winter of '92, I went inside the Arctic Circle to talk to the Swami Parliament. It was exactly what Link was talking about. As I'm talking about what's bothering them, they said, how do you know? Have you been studying the Swami? I said, no. It's because we're both talking in English and I know what the problems of Aboriginal subalterns are, having focused on one area. So therefore, it's not a permanent forgetfulness, but it is certainly a kind of not on top, but on tap use of these powerful languages. Only the very elite, the rich and the poor, are not equally free to sleep under the bridges of Paris. Someone was saying, the other day I was running a Mexican conference, and a very good-hearted young woman said, you know, can't there be something other than these Marta Lamas, the Mexican feminist, was talking about the struggles in Mexico. And so this woman said, can't there be something other than liberal doctrines that we could espouse? And I said this, I said, what you should ask is, who is free to deny these doctrines, the rich and the poor? So therefore, this is where my deep language learning stuff comes in. This is necessarily an inadequate explanation, but will have to suffice here. In this sort of below-the-radar rural situation, in eastern India at least, that is another problem. We tend to generalize too soon because of the alliances of the international civil society with the benevolent feudal feminism of the global south. This feudal is different from the serious way in which marriage is feudal. The problem-solving approach can apply to clearly visible cases of domestic violence. Without maximal follow-up, with all the infrastructure in place hierarchically in local and district-level administration, and more important, without an engagement supported by deep language learning and a renunciation of the conviction of having the answers, with the millennially established structures of feeling and desires, nothing achieved here will last when the engaged persons leave, as they necessarily must. And to an extent, you know, this kind of thing is when it is solved by enforcement alone. You know, legal change is incredibly necessary, but enforcement alone, without that supplementing epistemological preparation, whereby you lose time, you lose your own health, it doesn't work. Nothing will last. As for health and education in these areas, we must engage children rather than adults if we are to destabilize, internalize accepted gender patterns of behavior. And they must be destabilized at the same time as desires must be rearranged to develop intuitions of a democratic state. Even here, what other efforts the engaged intellectual might be able to bring to bear, remembering that the real change must be epistemic rather than merely epistemological, not just how you construct objects of knowledge, but some change in the way your mindset works. This is bigger than ideology. Rather than merely teaching at this level is the hardest kind of teaching I've ever done, because it is so easy. There's no one to judge me. There's no one to evaluate me. It is so easy to believe that I know everything. And of course, since in them what has been bred, as I say, by my ancestors millennially, is the instinct to obedience, so that you cannot trust what's going on. This is a very hard scene. I've never done anything more difficult and where you must not trust so-called results. Because it is also true that in so-called neutral discussion, these people are not dumb. So-called neutral discussion is a variation of obedience. Because it's a psyching out of the rich coming in from the centers who want to give back, quote unquote, and do a little good, you know, in their off times. So even here, what other efforts the engaged intellectual might be able to bring to bear, remembering that the real change must be epistemic rather than merely epistemological, is offset by the development of ethical and epistemic semiosis at home, cradled in an often traumatic child rearing, which is so deeply involved in the lessons of millennial class apartheid and gender division, that it is precisely the problem that one is trying very gingerly to solve from inside. It must be said, however, that the class apartheid here is more crippling than the gender divisions. As you enter the rural middle class, engendering shows its uglier face. Therefore, autobiographically and confessionally, rather than in an instructive mode, let me say that in the metropolis, encountering a sort of feminism that must itself fight with on-the-ground allogocentrism, recently internalized post-feminism, mainstream gay movements reproducing the morphology of reproductive heteronormativity, continuing juridico-legal fights, and confronting the underlying unexamined gender benevolence of the international civil society, allied with the feudality of the global south, I encounter, by contrast, upon the rural floor of this sort, a situation where involvement with women is pleasant, but their delighted reaction cannot be taken as evidence of the success of engagement. And therefore, giving time, skill undermined by repeated mistakes, because human equality as human sameness is too easily assumed, my feminist engagement goes into a pre-active moment, so that male and female children can learn simply to be the same and different, starting from nothing but having been born by phallus and the vagina, with phallus and vagina, nourished by breast, by guile, protected and destroyed by physical violence and subservience. And then I write, I must end now, which is your good fortune. If I don't get packed, I miss my train. These regular 10-day trips of intense labor remain bookended by the salaried work and the lecture circuits that provide the travel. And I'm very upfront about it. When Sneja invited me, I told her that this is one of the reasons this kind of instrumentalization should not bother people. You have no idea the kinds of places I go to in order to support these repeated incursions into, especially since the money goes for the schools. I take pleasure in being validated by the absence of financial recognition from the other end. Nothing but harassment from the US Internal Revenue Service periodically. I'm constantly, I have a 50-year-old green card, right? I have an Indian passport. And so therefore I'm constantly audited. I mean, that's also a luxury. It's a luxury I have with children. I'm a very institutionally powerful person. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not a nationalist. I'm as critical of the Republic of India, of which I'm a citizen, as of the United States of America, of which I'm a resident. I must end now, and so on. Let me end with what I had to produce so that I could at least deduct travel and expense from my income and the detailed account of my everyday that was demanded in order for this not to be questioned year after year. They haven't given up. This year also I've paid already $16,023 US as a fine. Because you have to a fine for having these schools, because it could be Al-Qaeda, right? You pay immediately, whether you have it in your checking account or not, because otherwise there'll be interest, right? So you fight later, which is happening. But anyway, so this is what I wrote. And this was written to the Internal Revenue Service of the United States of America. I doubt that anybody has ever written. I do not write grant proposals to preserve intellectual freedom. My project relates to the fact that national liberation does not always lead to a good and democratic society. Current research in the area, Farid Zakaria, Jack Snyder, etc., states that no society below a certain per capita level is ready for democracy. Zakaria, Snyder, and others in the field are social scientists. My research, relating to the work of such rare thinkers as John Shikwati in Kenya, investigates the reason for this. Typically, a newly liberated country, all this to the IRS, in the absence of established infrastructure, is obliged to put planning and developments in the hands of a vanguard. In the absence of a people educated in the habits of democracy, there are no constraints upon the vanguard, and social scientists declare the place unready for democracy. The generosity of human rights NGOs does not confront this problem, but perceives education as a human right. Typically, such work ends in fundraising, building schools, providing textbooks, and making this part of peacekeeping enforcement. I insist that focus must be placed on the quality, detailed quality of the education. There are 3 points here I write to the IRS. A, without deep language learning and long-term effort, no cultural infrastructure can be accessed. B, here Spivak's salaried work, I have to speak to them about money. She has been teaching full-time at US universities for 45 years. Her salaried work as part of the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society, with its insistence on deep language learning ignored in today's speed-oriented globalized world, can join her rural research. B, it doesn't, of course. B, the current quantified tests for educational success are unable to assess results here. C, because these largest sectors of the electorate have been oppressed, sometimes for millennia, as in the case of India or China, their cognitive mechanism has been damaged, and educational generalizations such as Dewey's or Montessori's do not apply. Work such as Paulo Freire's early attempts relates to making populations aware of oppression. Freire's word is conscientization. I believe that democratic habits and the intuitions of citizenship are developed in children under such difficult circumstances by changing their intellectual habits rather than developing political movements. In order to bring this about, Spivak is also interested in developing, quote, green habits in extreme poverty and interacting, which is very difficult, interacting with state leaders and the rural gentry to see how such educational efforts can be stabilized, and so on and so forth. On each research visit, Spivak, I said the whole thing is Spivak. Spivak participates in 2 training sessions per hamlet and meets with educators collectively on the final day to assess progress. Some time is spent in social interaction and monitoring, quote, green habits. This immense project is not yet well developed enough to result in direct publication, but incidental publication is all over the place. And then for 2 pages, I give them what I do every day, which I'm not going to read because they wanted to know that. It's ridiculous. It's hilarious what I do every day. Anyway, so I started this essay, I'm almost done, with an invocation of the first instance. These quotations have produced my last instance. You now have a vague and disembodied idea of how my days are spent. This is where I find my energies are rechanneled these days willy-nilly. It's not completely true, because I have a CD, remember I talked to you about it. I do talk in the United States to the young democratic socialists. I find the US left, it's okay, better to be on the left than shot till you drop, but the democratic socialists really did try to, with Michael Harrington, to enter into the machinery to do something, and especially the young democratic socialists, where there are even high school students, it's worth talking to them about the fact that socialism is not just winning their small battles, or when they're thinking about international outsourcing, you know, the cyber pulleys that I was talking about yesterday. We cannot just look at labor problems in our own neck of the woods, etc. So I do that, but here I said that that's where my energies are. It is because this experience allows me to find in its details some possibility of instruction that I compromise my other work, etc., etc. As I mentioned above, apart from insisting whenever possible that the girls and the boys receive equal attention and some other interventions of which I cannot speak, I can do little at the level of the children. I have 2 wonderful women teachers, and I have also a picture of them, which is on my computer if at any point anybody wants to see them. My 3 women teachers, 2 of them best, and the other good, not bad. I must judge. You know, I mean, come on. Don't loving parents know the difference between their children? I mean, I'm not their parent. I'm not in loco parentis. I'm just using this example. I'm nobody's mother. And many people's teacher, and even they're not a pedagogue. Anyway, so after insisting whenever, etc., I can do little at the level of the children. I have 2 wonderful women teachers, both of whom are from poor rural gentry, uneasily cooperating against the deeply ingrained prejudices of their origins. I commend them in this. I may even go so far as to say I love them. One little detail, let me tell you. You know these deaths of women with which we began, what a horrifying thing, and what epistemological and epistemic changes have to come in order for laws, now even good laws are not coming, in order laws to be not just enforced, because that is not a lasting thing. Okay. But here what happens is, this cognitive stuff, India has compulsory primary education. In the classes, these children, the so-called scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, right, that is to say, those who were put on a schedule in the 47-49 Constitution. These so-called untouchables, and you notice I don't use the word Dalit, that's another thing. The untouchables and tribals, they're put in one side of the room, and no attention is paid to them at all. In other words, they go from year after year to these schools where the teachers are coming very, very late, etc., and I won't name names, but sometimes very high up intellectuals living abroad who believe in the free and effective development will go in there and just say, and they won't go in, they will send people to write reports, and they will say that private teaching should be, private tuition should be made illegal. It's impossible there to make private tuition illegal because the teachers don't teach. So I sometimes say to the government people, please do not consider these schools to be non-formal. There is nothing more awful than to punish the very poor and to keep them from the mainstream by giving them non-formal education. So I say to them, this is free, collective, private tuition for the children of the extremely poor, or the SC/STs. So anyway, they were women, on the level of the rural adult female population, there are the two wives of the adult males most active in these circles who had come forward in the beginning to befriend me by serving me hand and foot. They were women of good faith from the lowest stratum of village life. I let them sleep in my own bed under the same mosquito net, a most unusual, one-of-a-kind piece of behavior to which they acceded, and I felt really stupid because, I was trying to behave in a kind of Christ-like way. I don't like sleeping with millions of people in a bed. So, but I felt increasingly that I had to incur a lot of unnecessary expense so that they could come to the various schools really as a way to visit other villages that was not open to them, and that otherwise this was a convenience for cooking for all of us. With great ambivalence, at a certain point I asked them not to come to the committee house anymore, and of course they were hurt. Yet my friendship with them continued because one of my schools was in their residential hamlets and I was very apologetic towards them. I've now instituted the practice of, quote, inviting them at the final day's general training meeting for all the teachers, followed by lunch. They enjoy the fact that they sit in chairs with me chatting while the men cook, and we point this out repeatedly laughing. Is this anything? Probably not. But, there it is. The government has programs for quota women about which there is research and experience, showing that although the practice should continue, it is at the moment so much in the hands of powerful men that it is the kind of supplementing that we are practicing that will change the situation in the remote to distant future. Examples of exceptional women can be brought forward. I congratulate them and befriend them when I can. But following Adrian Rich's commencement address to Smith College in 1979, I repeat the valuable lesson that exceptional women do not prove the rule. Asiya Jabbar writes about this too. Stars. Otherwise, there are projects for so-called self-help groups toward opening individual bank accounts. First of all, the government calls them self-help group. Okay, Shani Bardal, Swanir Bardal. You can't call people, this happens also in Bangladesh, Nigeria. The middle class gives these names which mean self-help, we do ourselves, etc. That's not okay, really. I mean, the women in those groups, they don't even know what Shanivar means. They just more or less say, Shanivar, we are members of the Shanivar. So, in the meantime, yes, opening bank accounts as an end in itself and then engage in tasks of cottage industry or general rural activities does not seem to me to be bringing in the sort of feminist systemic change that we are thinking about, because these accounts, well, I can't really talk about them, we're getting to be an hour. In the meantime, the more energetic of the two women I'm speaking of, deeply cradled in reproductive heteronormativity, one of them just gave her son in marriage to, I think, a 12 or 13-year-old woman. I can talk about that too, what one does. That's the example that I didn't read, which is in my notebook. Is often angry with me because I sacked one of her sons from the position of teacher after he had harmed the children through many, many months of inefficient teaching. I have just been obliged to discuss bad teaching with her second son, who has been made extremely ambitious to escape his group in some other way, through country town levels, spoken English, computer training, etc. This is a pitiful employment preparation, but who can blame him? He pays no attention to the children at all, teaches them with dismissal and impatience, keeping the job only because it brings in some money before he can get a better job. The woman is once again tremendously angry with me because she can perceive this only as a blow to her self-esteem, drawing her identity from her husband, a low-level factotum at the party office. And of course the party in power is still the Communist Party offices. A low-level factotum at the party office and from her sons. I consider the fact of her being able to express this anger a step forward in establishing equality, because normally she'd have to swallow this. Anyway, no one would be on that level anyway. With this absurd story of the limits to single issue feminism, I close these hesitant remarks drawn from my last instance. Let my closing words be, then, my repeated frustration, also the condition of possibility for all my work. Now, I cannot generalize. Thank you.